Hi, welcome back. This is Dr. Burton, and today we'll be starting Chapter 2 of Philosophical Foundation. And Chapter 2 has two major sections, sources of skepticism and sources of fideism. And I may have to break this down into smaller chunks. There's also a section at the end about informal fallacies. So I probably will break this down into smaller pieces, but let's get going. So we'll start with the Chapter 2, the beginning. Epistemology considers the question, how do I know? It must first consider the question, is knowledge possible? Here we will look at and respond to the claims of skepticism and fideism. Remember, skepticism says nobody can really know. Fideism is holding to the same assumption, nobody can really know, but we have to believe anyway. We will look at informal fallacies, which are common obstacles to engaging in argument. In chapters 3 and 4, we will look at a commonly understood definition of knowledge and objections to it. We will sketch an outline of how we could know by reason and argument, and then begin application to basic beliefs in metaphysics, what is real or eternal. Sources of skepticism. Skepticism is a form of intellectual despair. So think about despair as like hopelessness, right? There are several sources of skepticism which overlap, reinforce each other, and add up to create despair. Sources of skepticism depend on one's intellectual journey. They depend on one's epistemological point of departure and one's view of the goal or the good. Some are common, wide, but not deep. Some are philosophical, deep but not wide, and some are both wide and deep, where philosophy has influenced popular culture. Consistent skepticism denies that anything is clear. Skepticism is rooted in uncritically held assumptions. And so we'll look at those one by one, starting with worldview pluralism. There are many worldviews, and in any worldview there are many divisions. Some of these divisions are long-standing, and new divisions arise. All of this is prima facie evidence that the truth has not been reached and not likely to be reached. Skepticism seems to be an appropriate response to the existence of many worldviews. Other responses, however, can be considered. While there are many views, there are not many basic views. With respect to what is real or eternal, there are only two basic views. All is eternal in some form or other, or only some is eternal. That is, some is eternal and some is not eternal. These views are contradictory. Both cannot be true and both cannot be false. And it should be clear to reason which of the two contradictory views lacks coherence of meaning. And that's what the bulk of this book is going to be about. Furthermore, the many views are held according to differing degrees of consciousness and consistency. So awareness and being consistent in the level of commitment one has. No one is fully conscious of or consistent in one's basic beliefs. There is an admixture of both basic beliefs in each person. So each person holds to some version of all is eternal and only some is eternal, with differing levels of consciousness and consistency. There is an admixture of both basic beliefs in each person, with one being more basic, subjectively, than the other in each person. One's presupposition, epistemological personality, and then he says, see reason and personality in chapter 2, that's coming up, and cultural upbringing, or your background, affect the degree of consciousness and consistency in one's belief system. So let's bring that up again. Your presupposition, all or only some is eternal, your personality, your upbringing, which is your background, all of these affect the degree of consciousness and consistency that we hold to our basic belief. When conflicting beliefs within one's doxastic system surface, doxastic system, that's a cool word, right? It just means your belief system. When conflicting beliefs within your belief system surface, the belief which prevails in a person will depend on one's mood, That is, one's willingness at the moment to engage in critical thinking to consistently resolve the inconsistency. So when we face a contradiction, or we see something in our belief system conflicts, we have an option to change our mind, to re-examine, but it will depend on our mood. Are we seeking the good, or are we not seeking the good at that moment? So we will have to think about our willingness to think critically about our own basic beliefs. Okay, the next section in Sources of Skepticism is pragmatism and skepticism. What matters most is what works, or what matters is what works. Since in all cultures, human beings are born, grow, reproduce, and die, regardless of belief systems, these systems are thought to be not that relevant in relation to basic practical matters. Like, who wants to talk about metaphysics, right? It is thought that since the basic results are the same, differences in belief do not matter. The different beliefs are, pragmatically speaking, the same. So all beliefs are the same when it comes down to action. In response, it can be said that what we as persons do make choices about, how we live, and about the worldview and values of others we associate with, is important. It matters if we live under freedom or not, whether we are educated or not, whether we are monogamous or not. We seek more than animal survival. Belief systems shape cultural choices, and what works depends on one's view of the good, which depends on one's belief system. So when someone says it works for me, it works for what end, what goal? That's a function of your view of the good. Pragmatism, and this is held by philosophers such as Peirce, James, Dewey, and Rorty. Pragmatism, therefore, cannot sidestep metaphysical beliefs and worldviews based on these. So your view of the good depends on your view of what is real, which also gives you what human nature is. So what is good for human beings? We can't sidestep metaphysics to do ethics or merely act in this world. If mere instinctive animal existence is all that matters, fill their bellies and empty their heads, as Lao Tzu said, then discussion is beside the point. If humans are mere animals, then what are we talking about? Why are we talking? Animals don't do this. I have 2 on the floor right now in here. They're not interested in our conversation. But man does not live by bread alone. We need meaning. Rational existence goes beyond animal existence. Is that true? So if we're rational, we have beliefs, we have basic beliefs. And so pragmatism can't escape that. Okay, the next section is truth and power. Who is to say which view is right? Have you ever asked that? Who's to say which view is right? And who are you to say it? The way things seem to work out in history is by a power play or by tradition. Truth comes out of the end of a gun, imposed on a conquered people, see Foucault. It is later internalized and transmitted as the received tradition. The invaded are colonized, mind and body. Post-colonials who claim to resist hegemony can do so only to a degree. Those at a distance look on and ask, who's to say which view is right? I feel like we're going through this in our society today. This version of history is overly simplistic. Ideas are never inserted by mere power. They attempt to gain footing by ideology and propaganda, which rationalize the exercise of power. We are seeing that today, right? People who lose a grasp on reality are swayed by propaganda insofar as they do not think critically. So notice the antidote, thinking critically. In the Brave New World, unless the populace is continually drugged, religion is the opiate of the masses, says Marx, new ideas arise. The mere antithesis will naturally occur to some people. So there are gulags, but never enough. and the conquerors are often overtaken by the ideas of the conquered. Consider the Goths and the Vandals in Europe, and the Mongols in East and West and South Asia. In the final analysis, it is not who is to say what is right, but what is to say. Lasting authority is rational, not personal. It is based on insight, not might. Reason as the laws of thought is what is to say, and reason is common to all and in all. So remember, we talked about reason is authoritative. So here it is again. Reason is the authority, and it's authoritative among all humans, and it's also common ground for that reason. Okay, the next section, construction and deconstruction. It is all a matter of interpretation. Have you ever heard that? It's all a matter of interpretation. In contrast to objectivist claims in modernist narratives of reality grounded in the natural and social sciences, postmoderns have discerned meta-narratives at work in constructing any narrative of reality. Everywhere and always, interpretation and construction are at work, in contrast to a neutral or objective point of view. So the modernists thought they were being neutral. The postmodernists are pointing out, no, you're not neutral. You do construct narratives. Paradigms may shift in science. The current naturalistic evolutionary model replaced the theistic creation model and may itself one day be replaced. In the reading of literature, history, and scripture, interpretation is at work. Our own life experiences, inner and outer, are constantly being interpreted and reinterpreted by us and others. We have outgrown the naive objective neutrality of modernism and have entered the age of hermeneutics, in which no grand narrative is to be privileged or valorized. So that's the postmodern claim, right? Attempts to deconstruct dominant narratives are themselves merely alternative narratives told in light of meta-narratives which are current. So there's no escaping a narrative. Every worldview has a narrative. Narratives are a reality. So what to do about it? In response, it could be said that it is a higher level of awareness to recognize interpretation and construction at work. These are two functions of reason, in addition to the formative and critical uses of reason, which we discussed. But philosophy does not end with noticing interpretation. Rather, it begins there. It recognizes that no experience is meaningful without interpretation, and that we interpret experience in light of our basic beliefs. It recognizes that we construct a coherent world and life view based on interpretation, using good and necessary consequences of reason. The first work of philosophy, then, is to test basic beliefs for coherence of meaning. Some basic beliefs are seen to be incoherent upon critical examination. Interpretation grounded in an incoherent basic belief cannot be sound. One may say it is all a matter of interpretation, but not all interpretations are coherent. So that's going to be what a big chunk of this book is about, showing us which basic beliefs are not coherent. And in our day, it's a little bit difficult to say, I'm sorry, that belief is incoherent and can't be true. So thank you for playing. Relativism and tolerance. It is all relative. Have you heard people say that before? It's all relative? What does that mean? Tolerance is seen by many as a cardinal virtue. Absolute claims are seen as incompatible with tolerance. They are also seen as closed-minded and, as a matter of fact, contrary to the obvious reality of cultural relativism. Relativism requires religious tolerance, and tolerance in turn presupposes relativism, which assumes an absolute skepticism regarding any absolute claim. So, we need to be tolerant of one another because all views are relative, because nothing is absolute, and nobody could really know. So notice the assumption. Nobody can really know, so we can't make claims about basic beliefs. But is that true? Tolerance is a starting point of argument. It is not something to be argued for. Anyone with Anyone with politically correct sensibilities would know this. Diversity is to be affirmed. The other is not to be judged and excluded by external standards, but is to be included in a multicultural world. Why? Because everybody's got their own view, everybody's got their own narrative, and it's all relative. And relative to what, we need to ask. Here's the response. In response, it must be said that the relative tolerance of cultural relativism is not the absolute tolerance of individual liberty. Individual human rights are not guaranteed by cultural relativism, which would absolutize for the individual the cultural standard of the group into which one has been born or raised. We're seeing that today, aren't we? Individual human rights depend on one's view of human nature and of the good. Historically, it appeared in the Declaration of Independence that, quote, all men are created equal, end quote, and that, quote, they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, end quote. Happiness, though, should not be considered the good, and without the good, these rights may cause conflict and intolerance. I think that is what we're seeing today. We don't have the good in place. It's not a source of unity for us, and so people are becoming less tolerant of individual rights. Diversity is not merely in gender and ethnicity, but is intellectual in worldviews which cuts across all other diversity. So do we affirm intellectual diversity, that people have different ideas and can and should have different ideas, different beliefs, differing from the mainstream, differing from the majority? But affirming intellectual diversity would be affirming contradictory views. To include all, without freedom to discuss basic beliefs, is to exclude all from one and the same rational community, and to undo individual communities themselves. So, a community is based on unity of some sort, usually unity of basic beliefs and views of the good. But when we have a multicultural community that consists of conflicting, contradicting basic beliefs, that is not going to be a source of unity, and it's going to silence all of us at some point. If we don't recognize we're rational beings, and part of what our job is to discuss our differences in basic beliefs. For the obvious fact of cultural relativism is that each culture expresses a worldview, and that values in each are relative or rationally related to the basic beliefs of that worldview. So yes, views are relative to the basic beliefs of a worldview. Worldviews are constructed and altered to increase and preserve meaning. So that's the point of a worldview, to increase and preserve meaning. And insofar as they don't do that, they will be less and less held to, less and less promoted, and may die out. To flash freeze a culture by denying change through the process of a critical search for meaning is to falsely absolutize a culture and to become intolerant of the fundamental human need for meaning. In the name of openness, the mind of relativism has become closed. So we have to recognize there is a process of challenge and response in a worldview. When a challenge is raised and a response is given, that worldview can become more solidified to the people that adhere to it. But if a response is not given, a rational response is not given, that worldview ceases to be credible. And people will not hold to it or promote it. And if a culture is based upon that worldview, then it will collapse. Okay. Tradition and transcendence. There's no view from above. Now, this is another postmodern claim. Tradition is both universal and unique. Each person has a tradition or background in which one has been brought up. Yet the background for each person is, when fully accounted for, unique. Each person grows accustomed to one's familiar surroundings. Each person begins one's epistemological journey from a familiar territory. What we are comfortable with becomes the norm for truth. What is given by testimony filtered by the uniqueness of our being from our earliest and most impressionable age, is taken as truth, at least to begin with. And some have said that however far we go, we never leave home. Our destination, or destiny, is said to be determined by our origin. By early childhood, says Freud. By socioeconomics, says Marx. By the sum of pleasure, pain, stimuli, says Skinner. Or by biology, says Darwin. Or by geography, we were the land's before the land was ours. When tradition, in the broad or narrow sense, is taken as the standard of truth, and we encounter other traditions, our convictions either harden into prejudice or melt into uncertainties. Either of those are not desirable, right? You don't want to become prejudiced against other views or uncertain of your own view. We are then either estranged from others, as defined by our tradition, or from ourselves, as defined by our traditions. So what's the solution to this problem, this source of skepticism? Can we transcend tradition, or are we always historically situated? Is every aspect of our being conditioned, or only some aspects? Are basic aspects and basic beliefs conditioned? Or are we first Asian or European, or are we first human? Can we communicate with others, or are we locked out by alterity and incommensurability? Can we cross cultures? Can we leave ours and enter another by changing our basic beliefs and grow in our understanding of a new culture as we grew in understanding of our earlier culture? It is possible, right? It seems that conversions are too commonplace to deny. People convert from one basic belief to another. We can transcend tradition because, while all traditions seek in common to make sense of the world, all are not formed on foundations that have been equally subjected to critical reflection. So we might become more reflective and look for a tradition that makes more sense. Persons, as they come to think critically about basic things, may reject or reaffirm their tradition based on what they discover by critical thinking. While the rate of growth in understanding a new culture may be slowed by what must be unlearned from the old, the critical understanding can far exceed the merely traditional process which receives testimony without understanding. Critical thinking receives testimony based on understanding insofar as the meaning of testimony is consistent with basic things that are clear to reason, which is available to all persons. So notice, prior to receiving things from testimony, what others have said to us, is reason, which tests what is being said for meaning. And we can accept what's meaningful and reject what is not meaningful. Okay, moving on to the next section, persuasion and proof, pseudo-argument and sound argument. Given all our differences and different interests, short of the actual use of force to get our way, we seek to persuade. Is that true? Am I seeking to persuade you right now? Yet, given our differences, most of which arise from lack of critical self-examination, we do not seek to persuade through the critical use of reason, nor are we inclined to be so persuaded. There arises then a yawning gap between persuasion and proof. This is important to hear. Between rhetoric and logic, between propaganda and dialogue, between pseudo-argument and sound argument. Appeal is made to unenlightened self-interest rather than the good. So we're looking out for ourselves rather than seeking the good. Authority is personal rather than rational. Intuition by association replaces rational inference. Meaning is casually ignored or equivocated, all for presumed self-interest rather than common interest through common understanding. Since we are regularly persuaded by pseudo-arguments, see the list of informal fallacies at the end of this chapter, we persuade others in the same way. When pseudo-arguments do not work, We think no argument will work, and we give up on argument. And when sound arguments do not persuade, we think they are without any effect and give up on argument. Instead of working to understand what went wrong, we despair and yield to skepticism. So notice what's happening here. Oftentimes, we're not interested in the common good or the good for ourselves. We're more interested in getting what we want. We aren't interested in persuading through reason and logic and argument. We use intuition. We use self-interest. We try to persuade people non-rationally because we think that's all there is. We don't know what an argument looks like. We don't know how to use them. And when we have used them, maybe it didn't work. It didn't change the person's mind. It didn't change them. It didn't move them. But arguments do move us. If the good can be attained apart from understanding, why should we trouble ourselves or others with sound argument? Or, if lack of understanding has no long-term or lasting effect, why trouble ourselves or others to understand? But if the need for meaning through understanding is vital, if it makes all the difference in the world, if it is a matter of spiritual life and death both now and always, then seeking to understand is not seen as a burden. It's a necessity. The characteristics of the good must be brought into view and sustained in view, deepened in understanding, integrated into one's worldview, as well as incorporated into a way of life for all and by all who see the good to be intrinsically pleasurable. So notice all that. You have to first get the good into focus, sustain it in focus, deepen your understanding of it, integrate it into your worldview, incorporate it into a whole way of life where you live with others according to the good, and those people also find the good pleasurable. So it does require effort, doesn't it? All choosing and valuing is in relation to the good. We always choose according to what we think the good is. The effort to understand and to not be seduced by appearances of alluring pseudo-arguments makes sense only in relation to the good. Since the good is both grounded in and required by human nature, it is not only knowable, but inescapable and attainable by all. The siren song of intellectual despair is a lament grounded either in our being. Is a lament grounded neither in our being nor in other beings, but in the non-being of pseudo-arguments. Let me read that again. The siren song of intellectual despair is a lament grounded neither in our being nor in other beings, but in the non-being of pseudo-arguments. So despair is not a part of human nature. It's a part of pseudo-arguments, which are no arguments at all. Okay. Appearance and reality. Common sense and realism. All right. Many beliefs spontaneously occur by the constitution of our being. Just because we're sensing beings, sometimes things just come to us. They spontaneously occur. For example, the existence of the eternal world, other minds, and memory beliefs, for example, of where we were an hour ago, are immediately given and described as properly basic by philosopher Alvin Plantinga, or as common sense, Thomas Reid. In all ages, all people act on the basis of common sense almost all the time. Common sense is the simplest form of realism, that what appears to us is what is real. It uncritically or naively takes the world as it appears for reality. It assumes that appearance is reality. For example, the ocean is blue, the earth is flat, the sun rises in the east. These are all common sense assumptions. These are all appearances, not reality, yet they have been believed by all at some time. These judgments take the condition of the perceiver for granted. They work for everyday practical purposes until these purposes change or until the condition of the perceiver changes. Challenges to realism have been raised by anti-realists. And then he tells us to look at chapter 6, where he's going to discuss anti-realism and critique it. It's a popular view right now that says the physical world that appears to us is not real. It's an appearance. And it may be part of a projection, part of our narrative. John Locke's representational realism distinguished primary qualities, size and shape, as real, while secondary qualities, color, hardness, are mind-dependent. George Berkeley showed that both are mind-dependent, and David Hume showed we have no sense experience of cause or of mind. We've never seen cause. We've never seen a mind. Immanuel Kant's critical realism distinguished the phenomenal world of appearance as mind-dependent and knowable from the noumenal world, which is not the physical world, as mind-independent but unknowable. So Kant thought that what we see appears to us, but we have some categories that we impose on the world from our mind. So we never know the thing in itself out there in the world. And the noumenal world is, it's not mind dependent. It is unknowable. It's where things like the ground of morality, the soul, and God are. Those are not knowable to us because they're not empirical. We can't know them through our senses. But they are necessary for explanation of morality and the ground of morals. Okay, then these philosophers, Hegel, Schopenhauer, and Bradley, postulated varying degrees of idealism, that the world is idea, not physical, to fill this unknown that Kant gave us, all very far from common sense, but no closer to knowledge of reality. So there's a swing from Locke, who's talking about the physical world and the primary qualities that are knowable, to all the way going to idealism, where the world outside of us is an idea, not physical. So there's a swing. But none of them get us closer to knowledge of reality. Plantinga's contemporary return to Reid's common sense philosophy gains for it a place at the table by way of prima facie warrant, but without a principle of exclusion from the table. So, yeah, okay, maybe Plantinga gets people who take belief in God as properly basic a place at the conversation, but now that they're at the conversation, how do you exclude others from the conversation based on their properly basic belief too? Because now everyone can say, I have my properly basic belief. So without a principle of exclusion from the table, clarity and inexcusability become excluded. So if you say some things are clear to reason, they aren't going to accept that. And so those clarity people are excluded from the table. On this road to epistemological perdition, where no one is lost, no one can be saved. So this is good, because one of the implications of Plantinga's view is that if we have these properly basic beliefs and we have no control over them, then what about the person who doesn't have a belief in God? They have no control over that. And if it's wrong, well, then they can't be held accountable. And so at some point, God has to redeem them, right? So there's no people who are lost. There's no people who are saved. There's no exclusion. There's no inclusion. So we end up, again, in fideism with Plantinga's view, and skepticism with all the others. Intuition and certainty, sign and reality. Intuition, as a direct, immediate awareness of reality, is relied upon by many as the source of certainty. It is a direct and immediate it is direct and immediate in that it moves immediately. That is non-inferentially from the sign perceived to the reality, or it takes the sign for the reality. So intuition is the tool that we have for reading signs, except sometimes we think the sign is the reality and we go too far. For example, pleasure is the sign of the good, or the effect of possessing what we believe to be the good. Is that true? Can bad things give you pleasure? A smile is a sign of friendliness. Always? Sex is the sign and seal of love and is often taken as the reality or proof of love. So some people think because they had sex with that person must love them. A beautiful person, outwardly well-formed, is taken as a good person, inwardly well-formed, right? We can make that mistake. Are the Hollywood people, the beautiful people, good people? What does your intuition tell you? The more passionate the feeling aroused by the sign or symbol, the greater the certainty individually, subjectively. The particular, by metaphor, reveals the universal. For Keats, quote, "Truth is beauty, beauty truth. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." Isn't that true, though? That's the end of the quote. Intuition, the heart, not the head, guides us into and out of relationships. Is this how you operate in relationships? How does it make you feel? Artists and musicians feel deeply and express that feeling by natural signs, sound, and color. Intuited. Mystics in every land and every age and every worldview claim to experience oneness with ultimate reality. Intuition takes itself to be infallible in perceiving sign-reality relationships, insofar as it assumes this is a morally ideal world. Is it, though? For Rousseau, and for many, human beings are seen as naturally good, based on intuition. Evil arises not from within, but from outside the person in the environment. So you have to think about that. Do I have these assumptions too? Do I think that people are naturally good? Are they? We do not have good reason to believe that this is a morally ideal world, that the sign is always accompanied by the reality, that evil arises only from without. So is evil a part of your environment, or is evil within the heart of humans? A person may smile and be a villain, as example Shakespeare's Iago. Sensibility is not a better guide to relationships than sense, as in Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Passion is not a guide for politics. Passion can be equal on both sides of a controversy, and a person may switch sides with equal passion, right? One can have zeal without knowledge. Keats found truth is beauty only when frozen together in art, as in the Ode to the Grecian Urn, but not elsewhere in Lamia, La Belle Dame Sans Merci, and Eve of St. Agnes, other poems he wrote. Socrates did not find knowledge among the poets, and Plato restricted artists in his Republic. Why? Because they influence the heart without going through the mind, unless you're thinking critically about your music. Mystics, insofar as they think about their mystical experiences, interpret their experiences differently. For example, Nirvana, Brahman, the Tao, God. All of these are claims to mystical experiences. Rousseau does not get a free pass on his claim that evil is from one's environment in light of the creation-fall redemption worldview. Out of the heart proceeds evil thoughts, says Jesus. The heart is deceitful above all else, says Jeremiah. Feelings may arise from several sources, one's biology, one's basic beliefs, or one's natural sensibility, all of which are variable and commingle, making one's feelings and intuitions less than infallible and even less than a generally reliable guide in basic matters. So you might have good intuition, but don't trust it for all things, particularly about basic beliefs, where we need interpretation. So, trust reason if you're using it well. I'm looking at the time right now because I feel like we should pause and come back with to be continued in this section, because we still have several pages to go on these sources of skepticism. So I'm going to pause. We will come back and talk about empiricism, knowledge by sense experience, in part 2 of Sources of Skepticism. Thanks for joining me. Don't forget to come back to the next video and like, subscribe, and share with your friends. Get them involved in the conversation. Thank you for being here.